Alright, so I want to look at the insert mesh brush here. If I go to I and I choose any of these brushes, insert mesh is I, and then insert mesh brush. Insert mesh brush is different from an ordinary brush because it behaves completely different. It basically drags out another piece of geometry. So if I click and drag on this object, in the beginning nothing will happen because I have to enable this as a Polymesh 3D. And I do that by clicking on Make Polymesh 3D. And once I have that, I now have an object that I can sculpt on. But I'm going to go and do something else, and I'm going to drag out an insert mesh brush. And in this case here, I chose the first thing that I came across, which is if I choose the I and then insert mesh brushes, you have something called IMM Army Curve. So I want to choose something a little more basic than that so we can look at this thing and see how this brush method is applied. So if I select something like the primitives, you'll see that on top here you have a bunch of primitives. You have cubes, cylinders, pipes, spheres, so on, pills, capsules. So if I click and drag on the sphere, you notice I just drag out the piece of geometry that I have selected. With this list up on top here, I can grab anything. I can grab a cube and click and drag. This is pretty nice. But what exactly can we do with it? We can create intricate objects such as this belt over here, where you have a repeated pattern, a piece of geometry that is attached to a curve. But you may not want to drag out a row of these objects. You may want to do what I'm doing exactly now, where I'm just dragging out one piece of geometry, a sphere, something like that. And so what it's doing basically, it's attaching another piece of geometry to the selected geometry. And if we look over here on the subtool palette, you'll see that I still only have one subtool, which tells me that everything here is basically combining. So if I look at this a little further or closer, I'll notice that when I drag out an object, it becomes the active object. And when I release it, everything else behind it or that was created before is masked off. And if we hold down Control and drag, we can clear the mask. And so now here these are all basically combined as one object. And once again, if we look at the subtool, you'll see that you only have one subtool. If I go to Shift F, which is polygroup, every object here is assigned a new polygroup color. So as I'm dragging it out, it's giving it its own unique color, which allows me to then select it. So if I hold on Control and Shift and click, I can select the object. And this selection allows me to, split it. So I can go down to Split under the subtool palette and either Split Hidden or Split Group. And then now if you notice, I'll have two subtools because we've basically separated them. So if I go back to this other object here and I hold on Control Shift on these cubes, I can do the same thing, split, split hidden. So it's a way to quickly create geometry, which is really nice. But what's really cool about it is this thing here, where you create this intricate pieces of geometry that can even be repeated in a pattern. So if I go back to the insert mesh brushes, and I look for something else like the IMM industrial parts, insert mesh industrial parts, you'll notice that there's things that are probably a little more useful in a repeated pattern like bolts or screws. So I'll grab one of these Phillips screwdriver heads and click and drag. And see here you have this nice piece of geometry that's created, and you can just quickly add screws to your object. Or if you wanted to, you can add a row of objects by changing this method of applying it to a curve. So if I go up to Stroke on this top menu and I choose Curve and turn on Curve Mode, then what I'm allowed to do is drag a curve, and when I release you'll have this row of screwdriver Phillips head screws attached here. So now it's attached to a curve, which allows me to manipulate it. So I can move this curve around, or I can change the size of my brush and update it. So if I want smaller ones, I can do that, or if I want to make them really large, I can click on it again. There you go. And it's the same method. It has a curve, so as long as the curve is active, I can update this. Or you might want to just drag out a brand new one. I'll turn off the polyframe so it's a little bit clearer to see. And if I like its positioning and the spacing and so on, then I can click off of that object to release it. So once the curve is gone, you can no longer manipulate that curve. But now you have the option of either leaving it attached to the geometry. If I look at the polyframe, you have these poly grouping, or I can separate it. In this case, if you look at the poly grouping, there's two groups. There's the X in the middle, and then we have the flattened sphere on the outside. And if I select it, I'm going to select a group. So the easier way to select in this case is just to select the other object, double-clicking it, and then I can go split and split hidden. So now my screwdriver, my screws are actually on a separate subtool here, along with all this other junk. But you can separate it as you please. If you wanted to polygroup this, if you go down to auto groups on the polygroups, it'll create separate groups for each individual screw, but it won't keep the X in the middle. So that's a better way of doing it, because then now I can go in and pick one of these out, or multiple parts, and then split it. So the insert mesh brush in a very basic way is just geometry attached to a brush, and so instead of you actually like manipulating the object, you're actually just dragging out another piece of geometry on the surface of the geometry that you have selected. So I'm going to leave it at that, and then I'll show in the next video a little more complicated use of the insert mesh brush.